We're filming today's LFG podcast on the 2nd of July, coming off the back of an embarrassing day for the government and truly a depressing day for anyone in the UK that is looking for an optimistic future. Because yet again, we can see that there's a government failing to deliver, failing to act, and failing to capitalise on the opportunity in front of them. This government has had a year. It has a significant majority. It has a position which previous governments have desired but not been able to achieve. They've had 14 years to prepare. And what we are seeing is the same mistakes repeating themselves. This is not a comment on party politics, but on the inability for our political leaders to do what is necessary. If they cannot pass simple legislation through Parliament, how do we expect them to do large-scale reforms in planning to the tax system to enable this country to grow once more and to get us out of this cycle of decline we're in? It is truly staggering that we once again find ourselves in a position where Parliament is seemingly incapable of functioning at the level that is needed to get us out of the system and problems that we find ourselves continuously in. As I say, this is a sad time, regardless of where you sit on this issue. It is a clearly dysfunctional situation. The political leaders have been unable to build coalitions in order to put forward required legislation, sufficient agreement and coordination among their own party, despite the huge majority. This is frustrating, and it constantly points to the problem that we've been championing at LFG, which is that once again, our political leaders are failing and they're incapable of doing what we need them to do. Here at LFG, we want to pressure and we are going to push them to continuously be better. But I think today's an important day to reflect on how much work is needed. And for any of our political leaders watching, they need to recognise that they need to do a lot better in order for us to get out of the systematic decline that we're in. We're honoured here today on our podcast to have Scarlett Maguire with us, the founder of Merlin Strategy. Now, Scarlett, your journey is really interesting. You look Scarlett up on LinkedIn, you'll see it's fascinating background across journalism, production, and now into Merlin Strategy. Could you kind of walk us through your experiences from working at places like the BBC and ITN to reporting and political polling to how you got to creating Merlin Strategy and kind of what drove you and what led you there?
Yeah, so I used to work in political television. I actually started my career doing local radio, but I moved quite quickly into doing political work, so political research for political TV programmes, mostly at the BBC, which is where I started my career. I really enjoyed that. I got to work on some great programmes, so things like This Week with Andrew Neil and Michael Portillo. That was lots of fun. And then programmes like Newsnight as well. I went to ITV, worked at Peston programme. Finished my TV career working on the Andrew Neil show on Channel 4. So again, these are lots of interview shows, so political interview shows. I also did quite a lot of election nights and live debates. They were all lots of fun. But when I'd finished doing the Andrew Neil show, I was definitely ready to do something a bit different. I'd always used quite a lot of polling in my work in television and in my political journalism. And so I was very interested to do more with it. I was lucky that I was approached by my old employers for a job. Fantastic, really, really enjoyed it. Got to spend 2 years working in polling across the world. Did a lot of work in America as well. Sorry, excuse me. And then off the back of that, I decided it would be a great time to start Merlin. So it's called Merlin after my dog, which is maybe a bit embarrassing, but exactly.
Great.
So, but I always like the name. And the sort of imagery of wizardry that it conjured up, not that I'm doing sort of conjuring work with my numbers, obviously. But what I wanted for Merlin was that it could really tie together my experience with polling and media. And so it's research, it's strategic insights, but really with an end goal and to what it's actually used for. So what the client wants to achieve or how the polling and the research fits into a larger whole. Because I feel like that's what's quite often missing with pollsters. They're fantastic, they're great people. They're amazing with data, but quite often they cannot be as good with the follow-through, like what's it used for, how do you use it, and where it fits into that wider picture.
Yeah, I think that's... Like, can you take that from the kind of institutional lens, right, where you've worked with obviously large corporations, large things like BBC, Andrew Neil's show, etc., and now you've got your own entity. Like, what were the kind of different pressures you faced there? What are the kind of what have you learned from working with organisations versus what you can now do when you've got a little bit more freedom yourself?
So when you work in those organisations, it can be very different depending on what programme you're on. So I was very lucky that I'd started, as I said, my first proper TV show in the BBC was This Week. And that really operated as its own unit, and it was able to get things done really quickly. It was able to operate almost outside the BBC's licence. It was actually made by an independent production company, even though it was aired at the BBC and came out of BBC Studios, and obviously worked a lot with the BBC. And still ultimately answerable to the BBC. But it was really, really nimble. I then worked on programmes that were less nimble and potentially more bogged down in layers of bureaucracy and management, although a lot of those programmes are facing quite big cuts and so already have lost quite a lot of their staff. And what I definitely think, though, is that I prefer smaller, more agile units. Like, obviously, we'll see what happens with Merlin and where it might be in a few years' time. But I really like, and I think one of the reasons why I like looking for growth so much is that I like getting things done. And that's not always easy in big places.
Yeah. And kind of, you touched on it there about like political polling and how much does it inform decisions that go through like the BBC? Like how much does it lead stories versus the reverse of like the story already, and therefore polling informs that versus actually the polling is what drives the story?
So we were always taught at the BBC, it's different in different places, but there's a general prevailing attitude that voting intention polls, so just straightforward horse race questions, should never lead stories in and of themselves. We've seen that be relaxed a bit. Quite a few more places are leading with the stories, especially if they've commissioned them themselves, so understandably. And especially, I guess, when it is so interesting to people. So, for example, the first time Reform led in a voting intention poll here, that made news. And I can actually completely see why that would make news, but there's normally a bit more hesitation over leading on just plain voting intention stories. We can see on a day-to-day basis that polling can lead news stories, and I think that's why it's so... it's one of the reasons why I enjoy it so much, because it's fantastic at taking a read on what people think. And I think there can be quite often disjunct between what people think and what politicians think people think. And so if you can draw attention via the media to what people actually think, I think that can be quite helpful to inform politicians.
So your first bit of big polling, Will, LFG, check it out on the website if you haven't already, showed that people are quite down about the state of Britain. Do you think this was the case 10, 20, 30 years ago? And if not, why?
No, I do think people have been feeling a lot worse recently, and I think, I think they've been feeling about as bad, for the last year or so. I think this is very clear in the general election. I think we'll come on to talk in a bit probably about the politics of today. Yeah. But I've been quite surprised how slow some politicians have been on the uptake to the mood out there amongst the public. I think they're starting to get a better sense of it now. But no, I think it's been particularly bad since COVID. And especially when you talk to people, outside London, when you do focus groups with them, it's really, really clear the scar that COVID and the recovery from COVID and the recovery from lockdowns, the scars that it's left on those communities. They'll say, I used to go to the pub before COVID, but now they're all shut, or now my high street is unrecognisable. And it feels like it really sped up the decline that I think was already visible. A lot of these places were already feeling left behind.
Like a bit of a catalyst.
Yeah, exactly. And so when you speak to people, COVID seems like a real sort of AD-BC moment for them in terms of when they imagined anyway that they were feeling better before. So no, you're absolutely right. The findings from Looking for Growth made for actually some really, really bleak reading. But I don't think it's anything very new. I think it's something from the last few years.
So how many years would you roughly guess?
Again, so I'd say I think that this country has properly struggled to recover since the financial crash. And I do feel like general confidence in the country and its future has been declining since then, as well as trust in our key institutions, not to mention trust in politicians. But I think it's been particularly pronounced over the last 5 years since COVID.
And do you think there's any space in that for a movement like LFG or others that are kind of doing similar things to try reverse that?
Absolutely. I've been struck when I've done events with LFG. The energy is extraordinary. The fact that so many people turn out because they would like to change. They would like to make a difference. I think that's really pointing to the fact that there is potential out there, and there's clearly the will to make things better. I guess it's just about how that actually translates into action, ultimately making a change.
Yeah, and that's like a real critical part, right? Which is you go to events, and the one thing you can get agreement on from everyone is that everything's broken and things just suck. It's really bad. And how much do you find from your kind of polling is one, obviously that angle no doubt comes out as it did for the LFG poll, etc. But also what needs to be fixed? Like, is there a disconnect for politicians? Because it seems fairly obvious to a bunch of people, many in LFG, of these are critical things you need to address. but politicians seem incapable or unwilling to do it. Is that because there's actually a lot more noise out there, there's a lot more uncertainty, or is it just that's not being captured yet? How do you see, like, when you go around talking to people, do you see similarities of what people are really saying? Look, fix this. Why is no one grappling with it?
I'm aware that I can quite often see it sound incredibly critical of politicians, and I do get frustrated by some of the things that we watch, but I also have sympathy for them as well. I think it's very hard when you're caught up in the day-to-day job, and especially when the pressures of our media systems, and again, which I have a lot of sympathy for, I like, as we said, I was a journalist and a lot of my friends are journalists, and I think they do great work a lot of the time, but also there is a general bubble, an echo chamber, and I think that can create the wrong incentives for politicians and also just distract them all the time in a way that actually, again, I have a lot of sympathy for it. I'm not sure I'd be any better were I to be in the job, but it's not very conducive to A, listening to what their voters actually want from them, and then B, delivering on those goals. So I'm actually hugely sympathetic as to how they can end up in the position they end up in, especially sort of en masse, because that tends to be what happens. But they have definitely been slow to the uptake on a few things. I think Brexit was a real cry for help. It was a cry for help from lots of parts of the country that did not feel like they'd benefited from any, they wouldn't use the term economic growth, but they feel like they were being left behind. So they were feeling like they were being left behind by elements of globalization in a changing world that just was not working for them. They were also obviously picking up, I think, on the general stagnation of our living standards since the financial crash that I said. And again, that's especially visible outside London. It can't be said enough that London and the South East a lot of the time does not look like the rest of the country. And we live in one of the most unequal countries for that in the world. It is very, very noticeable, especially when you spend a lot of your time, like I do, going to these parts of the country to do focus groups. So there's a lot of frustration there. But yes, the Westminster, I think, sort of insider class has been very slow on a few things. And I think we've noticed one of those things recently in terms of the very sudden change in attitude. So any pollster worth their salt, although indeed quite a few didn't, but any pollster worth their salt could tell you since Brexit that the public were not happy about the immigration system that this country had. And they did not feel like it was working for them. They thought it was negatively impacting their communities and their living standards. Now, you can argue whether they were right or wrong to feel like that, but it is undeniable that they did feel like that. And the vote for Brexit was in many ways, yes, it was a frustration at the European Union. Yes, it was a vote for sovereignty, a frustration that they were voting for people who weren't ultimately accountable for the direction in which Britain travelled. But a lot of it was a vote against an immigration system they didn't think was working. Now, of course, then we had Brexit was in 2016. We then had a 2019 election, which was just to get Brexit done, which again, I think you could read as another proxy vote on these issues. And then, of course, what happened was a spike in immigration. Now, even though this was the case, when I was doing broadcast interviews 2 years ago, I'd go on TV and I'd say with a very straight face, as I do, just say what people think, say, well, X many people are not happy with this current immigration system. That was a controversial thing to say 2 years ago. Now, of course, fast forward 2 years, we see that it's mainstream Labour Party policy. We saw that immigration paper that came out. Keir Starmer now says he regrets some of the language around it, but the change of tone from the sort of Westminster bubble is very, very clear, and has been made very quickly. And that has taken years too long, I think, to catch up. Now, again, if you're a politician that wants to make the case for increased immigration or even just the status quo that we have at the moment, that's absolutely fine, and their prerogative to do so, but they have to fundamentally acknowledge where people are to start with, and then they can start making the case.
Yeah, and just how much do you see this as like kind of one of the angles I pick up quite a bit is like this failure of leadership. I fully support your view of like being a politician is actually a really tricky job. You have so many different competing priorities, so many different things you're like trying to navigate, etc. There's no doubt like more we can do in terms of like improving, potentially some of our talent within our political realm. But actually, like it's a really tough job. But these things you're mentioning, right? Like this Brexit, immigration, it was very clear at the time. Like this is a group of people across the country who are really unhappy with the status quo, the direction of the country. 2019 again. More recently, and the fact that now you have such a knee-jerk reaction just feels like such a disconnect. And how much of this is actually the fact that you don't have political leaders who have strong views on this stuff or actually are thinking, well, how do I improve the country? And are really disconnected to actually the day-to-day lives of the general population.
I absolutely think that's an issue, and you're right. It's a disconnect. I mean, it's a disconnect that's taken basically a decade for the Westminster politicians to get themselves on the same page as the public. I mean, that is quite extraordinary, and crucially, that decade has done an awful lot of damage to trust in politicians, trust in our electoral system, which is then only going to make it harder for politicians to be able to address these problems and harder for the right people, I think, to come through. And so these things, it's not just that it takes too long and then people get left behind. It's that it's actively damaging the more time it takes for politicians to get onto the same page as their voters. I think we have seen a string of leadership recently where you can look at Keir Starmer, you can look at Rishi Sunak before that, and again, you can have sympathy for these people personally, or you might not, but you can have sympathy for them personally, but you think, well, I think it's undeniable that even if they've had a clear vision, they've certainly failed to articulate it. And then, we're quite used to people changing their minds. And I think had Rishi Sunak and then Keir Starmer after him sort of was selling themselves on technocratic competence. And I don't think that's enough.
Yeah. And that, I mean, it feels to me like a strange angle. And this will be interesting to get from your experiences you have. You may not have done formal polling on it, but the kind of, I don't get a sense that people want leaders who they feel are just technocratically very competent, very kind of, oh good, we're going to have a very systematic approach to how we deal with these problems, rather than someone who actually has this vision to say, like, the world's really complex, lots of challenging things are coming. I will lead you, and you can feel confident in me as an individual and the way I lead this party. Like, do you sense that actually people are just turning around saying, no, I really just want someone who is a steady ship and understands, can get on with the job, versus someone who's like, no, I believe that leader and I trust them.
I think this is the difference between sort of noting down what the public had to say and then properly listening to them. Because if you sat through focus groups or looked at polls in the wake of what was happening to the Conservative Party after they went through Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss and then finally with Rishi Sunak, and they would say, I don't want any more drama. I just want, someone boring would be great. And actually, the public never mean they actually want a boring leader. They might say it. And again, that's not to say they're lying or they're being two-faced or anything like that. No, what they mean is they don't want you to change leaders lots of times. And because, again, that's distracting from what's getting done. But they never actually really mean they genuinely want someone who is boring, who does not have a vision. And I think that's quite a common misunderstanding. I think some people can be far too literal when getting an answer on things like that and think, okay, note down, right, so they want someone boring, okay, let's give them someone really boring then, and then everything will go fine. I just don't think that's quite how it works.
Yeah, interesting.
What messages do you think actually resonate with people then? Because I think with Tories and Labour, they try, they'll say we're investing XYZ into XYZ and we're doing this and we're building that. And they kind of struggle with their credibility almost. What do you think messages actually would work and resonate with people? Is it a trust issue?
I think fundamentally it comes down to trust, because the trust has been so broken in politics and politicians that even if they were to set out now a policy agenda that they were very excited about, the public are already sort of tuned out. And again, this was a problem that Rishi Sunak had towards his administration. And we're already starting to hear people complain about that with Labour. I did a focus group recently and I tried to talk to members in the focus group about the 10-year plan for the NHS, and I said, government's got its 10-year plan for the NHS, and they started laughing. I said, why are you laughing? I was like, why are you laughing? And they were laughing because they didn't think this government was going to be here in 10 years, and they just thought it was ridiculous to even talk about a 10-year plan. They're not, people are not listening to them anymore. So it absolutely comes down to a level of trust. Now, there's other ways you can do effective messaging, and we saw this from Labour at the last election. They basically ran on the message saying the country's broken. You desperately need to change. And that really tapped into how people were feeling. Yes, they thought, yes, the country is broken and we need to change. They were never completely sold on Labour being that change. That's why they only got about a third of the vote nationally, which was lower than Labour were expecting. It was lower than a lot of commentators were expecting. It was lower than most of the polls said they would get. And that's because they never quite sold their vision. But people were so fed up with the Conservatives, they were prepared to vote for anything else to get that change. Absolutely fine. But what they didn't get was then the vision. And I think it's quite interesting at the moment because now we have the Reform Party who've made, doubled their vote share since the last general election, who put in a very strong performance at the local elections that we had in May this year. And their current slogan is Britain is broken, which is remarkably similar to what Labour were doing this time last year. But I think it's interesting because I think Reform should learn from Labour. And it's not just enough to diagnose the problem. As you were saying at the beginning, you have to start actually setting out some of the solutions as well.
Yeah. And this is an interesting angle from my side in terms of when Labour talk about the fact we have broken Britain and we need to repair it, and they didn't have this vision. And you now have reform growing in popularity, and a lot of people are, I feel at least within the Westminster bubble, within the political sphere more generally, is like, oh, it's a protest vote. People are unhappy because it's not quite going how they expected, etc. And I don't get that sense. I actually get the sense that people have reached a point where it's no longer like, I want to give the Labour or Conservatives a kicking. It's actually just a complete desperation now of they're broken, they can't fulfill their mandates, they can't do what's necessary, and therefore I'm going to actively vote for something new, which at the moment is reform, and that's the option. Does that chime with what you're getting from people?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good diagnosis. And one of the things I was most interested in from the last wave of the Looking for Growth tracker that we did was I was looking at the data afterwards, and it struck me that on these questions about how much of decline Britain is in, how angry people are about the state of Britain, how pessimistic they are about its future, Reform and Green voters were much closer together than Reform and Conservative voters, for example. So it's not even so much a political spectrum thing. It's interesting to see how there's that relationship between pessimism, and I don't really like the word populism, but for want of a better term, for populism. And if you are fed up with the state of the country, which an awful lot of people are, then actually going for something that, is in inverted commas, a risk, or something people say, oh, no, you can't do that because, it's unknown, all the rest of it. Well, that's, taking that chance seems less of a risk than staying with the status quo, because the status quo seems so bad. And as you say, I think that's where a lot of people are right now. And it's actually why I was listening, I was on doing some local radio coverage on the BBC after the local elections, and there was a Conservative on before me, a Conservative politician, who said, basically, don't worry about reform. It's just a protest vote, so it means it will go away. And I had the opposite response. I said, well, I think it is a protest vote, but I think that's what actually makes it more solid. And if I was the mainstream parties, that's what I'd be more worried about, because actually when people, that's not going to change. And it's not because they think Nigel Farage is their messiah and they think he's sort of untouchable and all the rest of it, not at all. It's because they are so desperate for change.
Yeah, that's kind of, it's kind of terrifying, right? Terrifying in terms of how, again, that disconnect between politicians and where the public are. Like, if there's politicians who are saying, as I know there are, that reform is just a protest vote, it'll kind of go away in the wind, kind of taking for granted that, our voters will come back. They're just trying to give us a kicking. And that, again, it's a real failure to understand the frustration that's out there, and that people want something different.
Do you think people would actively vote for risky things then, and have more respect for that then? Is that something that, like, if you were talking to any of the political parties, you would be recommending?
Well, I would definitely be advising them to outline a vision that they believed in and stick to it at the very least. I think is a good starting point. And obviously those things should be properly costed and all the rest of it, although not in an OBR type way. But I'm not saying they should just make things up completely and sort of go with it whatever and go for something that sounds as wacky as possible. No, but you're right. I do think it means there is appetite. Although I think there is a way to misunderstand this as well. Yeah. So I think that, for example, what you're seeing in America at the moment is there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of excitement about the new Democrat nominee to be mayor of New York, for example. And they had this in response to Trump 1.0, and they're now having it in response to Trump 2.0, say this means we need to be bolder, and that means we need to be much, much more left-wing and progressive. And actually, especially in America, that won't work, right? Because they need to get the sort of median American voter on board, which is not going to happen with those sorts of policies. But it is a sort of knee-factor stop. And you see some left-wing Labour MPs here argue the same. Now, I don't think they're right in that there is a massive mandate for that in this country. However, there is a mandate in this country, and actually we're in a position now where if you look at Keir Starmer at the moment, Labour's polling about 20-25% of the vote, around 25%, close to 25% and 20%, depending where you look. That is incredibly low for Labour. They recorded some of their, down there rather, with their lowest ever in the last 50 years, according to Pollster Ipsos, which have been tracking it for this long. And Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 got 40% of the vote. Now, that was a very different election, and that was a two-horse race, and there were lots of other factors at play here. But there is, at least if you have something that you believe in, you can bank on a core of voters that will come out for you no matter what and that will fight for you. And I think that is what something like Starmer's Labour is lacking. I think there's quite a lot, despite what you just said, I do think there is an opportunity for a movement on the, just like we've seen with reform, which again, I don't even necessarily would, like they've come out of Nigel Farage, who obviously has a history of being the right of centre politician. They're now attracting voters that aren't necessarily right of centre. Some of the people that are coming to them now are much more socially liberal, very agitated about climate change, for example, all that sort of stuff. But broadly speaking, if you categorise them as a populist movement to the right, there's a huge amount of potential for one with the left, again, offering bolder ideas on these sorts of things. And I'm quite interested to see the Green Leadership Contest, actually, I think, officially kicked off today. I'm very interested to see what happens with that. But all of that was a very long-winded way of saying that I think there is more of an appetite for people to put stuff out there and then stick to it.
Yeah, cool.
So taking that kind of, building this idea, not a political party, but the one thing we get kind of pushed on from looking for growth angle is like, well, what do you mean by growth? And the government's obviously put as one of its staples is economic growth. I think actually almost every government I can remember has one of its top priorities as growth, ignoring the fact that a bunch of them never actually delivered it. But like it's clearly been a political priority, but messaging on it never seems to land. And a lot of the focus is obviously on GDP growth and how's that going, and with how are we in the G7. And I always feel like that misses the point. Like it's not that we just want to see line go up on GDP graph. It's all the spillover effects of that. It's all like what it enables and what it provides. And going back to your kind of Brexit point of places that are left behind, like why is your high street closing? That's what growth can deliver. You need businesses coming in, you need investment coming in, and that's what then builds more jobs, puts more investment in. But it seems like a really difficult message to land, especially from a political party angle. Why do you think that is, and where do you think the gaps are for people to kind of land that?
I mean, you're absolutely right. It is very difficult. I can see why politicians talk about it, because it's one of the most, if not the most important thing, to be able to then get a country functioning in the way it needs to. And we are in desperate need for actual growth in this country. So I can completely sympathise with Labour saying we're going to go all in on growth. But you're right in saying it does not land with the public. And the public have become actually, if anything, very suspicious of growth. And I think this is for a few reasons. So one of the poll questions that we first asked with looking for growth was, which of the following comes closer to your view, which of these two statements? And the one that had majority agreement was, politicians have talked about growth for years, but I've never felt anything personally. And I think this is part of the problem, is I think politicians have been talking up growth in a lot, but a lot of the time we're talking about, as you all know, fractional decimal points of growth, if that, and then saying this is fantastic. And then again, so first of all, it's not big enough growth for people to actually feel, and it's concentrated in certain parts of the country. It doesn't reach most parts of the country. So the public feel very alienated by growth, because they think, well, whatever growth has happened so far, I've not felt any of the benefits from. And so there's this sense that the government is acting in someone else's interest, not theirs. And so if they're talking about growth, that will benefit rich people, it will benefit bankers, it will benefit the elites, and it will actually potentially even make them worse off. And I think this is, again, it's tapping into that things we were saying about Brexit earlier, was that Brexit was a sort of vote against a system that a lot of people who supported Remain said were working fantastically for the country. Other people did not feel it. And if they didn't feel it, you can't expect them to be thankful for it or excited about it. And that's where we are with growth. So it's very interesting. People don't really understand growth when you talk to them. They don't really understand GDP. Again, I don't think that's a problem. They do understand living standards. And living standards is something they can get their head around, and something they've always expected, or at least expected to go up. We saw living standards soar in this country in post-war period, and then continue to overall trajectory be very good. And so you're now dealing with generations that are, contemplating a less steep increase or even a decline, and they don't take to that very well. And I think that's what we're grappling with at the moment. So I think I now find it much more effective when I'm talking about how people feel about growth and about, the economy stuff. I nearly always frame it in terms of living standards, and I feel like then you have quite a lot more luck in ascertaining what people actually think about it.
Do you think that's what, so say 5 years from now, we're going to get, are we going to get kind of new voting coalitions, and kind of what groups of people are we going to see moving into them? So you were saying like the Green Party and Reform, was it, that actually have quite similar opinions on some stuff? Like, what's that going to look like? Is it going to be a thing of like people that have gone through their career post 2008?
It is really interesting because young people do seem to be more disenfranchised. Now, there's nothing necessarily that new about this, and that younger people have been historically less likely to vote, don't turn out as much, don't engage as much in our political system as older people do. I think you could see that become quite a lot, more pronounced. I'm really interested to see what happens at the next election. Even just anecdotally talking to my friends, I can see that a lot of them have completely tuned out of the political system and just don't, are not really willing to engage with it at all, even to vote in it. Saying no, that's not really. I'm past that now, and there's no one that really appeals to me. So I definitely think there is something about people sort of, millennial generations and younger feeling alienated from that, whatever politics has resulted in the society they're now finding themselves in, and not really wanting any part of it. In terms of the new voter coalitions, it's really interesting. So yeah, Conservatives and Greens Reform and Greens can feel similarly in terms of their frustration at the current system. They can look different on other things, but again, there's quite a lot of things that they have in common as well. I'm quite interested in see how that coalition shapes up. I think there's not enough attention at the moment into Reform's coalition, and actually how the sort of different stages of the Reform coalition, depending on where they might have come on board with the party, who have very differing views.
Yeah.
They're as in general, they're pretty united behind Reform, more so than other party voters are. But there are other issues which will split them a bit more, and so that's quite interesting. And I think not enough attention has been given to that. But no, I think more and more and more you will see people who voted for, say, our traditional two parties their whole lives say, not this time. And whether that means they vote for someone else, be it Reform, be it Greens, be it Lib Dems, actually Lib Dems I think also will probably do well out of this environment, or they don't vote at all. That's another question, but I think you will see, we've already seen those old voting pattern breaks, but I think we'll see them break down even further.
And do you, separate to kind of the voting blocks, do you see the kind of issue, again, back to politicians? Obviously, as an MP, especially if you're a backbench MP, you necessarily don't have a lot of control over what the government's doing. So you're going to focus heavily on constituency. How much does that really matter? Because there's like a weird incentive playoff, right, with MPs, where they're obviously there to represent their local constituent. But it feels like, from albeit my inexperienced view, that a lot of the actual likelihood of them getting voted on or not is going to be shaped by the national landscape and what that looks like. How would you suggest politicians navigate that in terms of, like, if you don't drive these big reforms through and you don't deliver things that are going to help across the country and make it look like we're getting out of decline, it doesn't really matter how much of a champion you are locally, because you're going to get steamrolled because you're failing nationally.
It's a great question, and we're obviously now seeing Labour struggle because their backbenchers are not voting with them on these things. They're starting to vote and rebel on huge scale, I think much bigger scale than anyone anticipated at this point during a Keir Starmer premiership. But they're in a really tricky bind, because received wisdom sort of says that the local dynamics barely matter at all. It's a percentage or two in it. Either way, we did see that change a bit in the last election. The last election, the constituencies behaved in more idiosyncratic ways, and the work people had done as a local MP could make a bit of a difference. There are certainly examples where, for example, if you look at some seats in a red wall, a couple of Conservatives managed to withhold that sort of withstand that sort of tidal wave in a way that they, on paper, shouldn't have been able to, and or nearly withstood it, only just got blown away. And that seemed to be because they were very well known locally, they were very liked locally, and they were managed to sort of beg their constituents to not vote Reform, for example. And so local dynamics, I think, will matter more, especially when we're now in this environment as well, where the constituencies are now, we had a lot of these at the last election anyway, but we're going to have fewer constituencies which are just two-party fights, and much more which are 3, 4, 5-party fights. And when that happens, you can win with 25% of the vote. Maybe even less, but we had someone win the last election with, I think it was 26% of the vote, but it's astonishingly low percentage of the vote. That will happen more and more, and when that happens, local dynamics can be incredibly important. But you're absolutely right. There can be, your obligation. Yes, you need to be a fantastic local MP and answer to your constituents, but there has to be a sense of your national purpose and how you fit into that as well. And actually, you're going to be hamstrung if your government becomes a laughingstock, which is what happens to the previous Conservatives, and what risks, after we've seen things like today, what risks happening to this Labour government as well. But again, it's actually one of the examples where they're in a fantastically tricky position because their local standing can matter.
Yeah, and that's. How worried are you about that dynamic issue, right? Because given the system of governments we have, so much of actual local growth, for the broad term that it is, is driven by national decisions, like national decisions in terms of the tax revenue and therefore how much they allocate out to different local authorities, also in terms of planning and enabling house building, etc. But from a local standpoint, some of that stuff is really negatively perceived. So if you're local, the general wisdom, if you're a politician in a local area, you oppose new construction and always say, oh, it's not the right place, it should be in my neighbour's constituency who happens to be part of the other political party. Whereas actually, some of these like entrenched issues we have around getting investment into places, making places feel better, improving them, etc., comes from national changes, which at a local level are potentially unpopular. Like, how are you worried about how do MPs navigate this?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm torn because in theory I've always quite liked that. Unlike other countries, our MPs are very locally accountable. I've always thought that's quite a nice, healthy thing for democracy, for people to be able to see and talk to their MP and be able to identify them and be able to petition them. I don't mean actually literally one of those petitions with thousands of signatures and stuff, but, to be able to talk to them. I've always thought that's actually a very nice idea and a thing that a lot of people don't have. But you're absolutely right. I think we've seen the undeniable flaws in it recently as well. And the fact that I think you can end up catering to things that are against the country's interest, actually ultimately against their own constituency's interest as well. And I think that can be very difficult. And actually, again, a little bit much to ask that each individual MP to sort of resolve on their own. The other aspect I'm worried about as well is the fact that, again, in this fractured system and in a system where local conditions matter a lot more, you will potentially see MP standing catering to more and more niche groups and potentially more extreme groups as well. And I think that is also a worry and part of this same thing.
The one angle we've also kind of briefly touched upon, but it'd be good to get your view, especially having your background in journalism, is this trust issue. And I think it'd be interesting to get your sense on how do people feel politicians versus also the media are kind of the driving factor behind the lack of trust. Maybe phrased in a better way, how much do you think the media is reacting to an issue of trust versus also creating that issue of trust? So much of the information people get right either from social media or from mainstream sources such as the BBC, etc. And if they're feeling like, oh, this information is being skewed or is being pushed towards to get more views, etc., do you see that as actually being something where the politicians are constantly fighting this losing battle when no matter you can't see your good politicians come through, because actually it's always fun to find the one that's done an expense scandal and build that up. We're not going to talk about the MP who's driving forward some new great initiative.
Yeah, I think it's both, and that nature is reciprocal, and they as you quite rightly say, they fuel each other. I think we have seen trust hugely decline in institutions like media outlets and politicians since COVID actually. And I think a lot of that was partly because people were because I think we were getting what was going on in our day-to-day lives from, quite often from the TV screen, say of the, BBC or another broadcaster broadcasting straight into our house what the politicians were telling us. And I think a lot of people now in hindsight, even though when you poll them, people will say, I haven't polled it that recently, but before when you'd ask people, people were in favour of longer, harsher lockdowns, at least in theory when you ask them. But there is definitely a sense now that some of the trade-offs they were asked for were potentially too big. Or, again, what happened with the politicians when revelations around Partygate and that trust was fundamentally broken. And so I think there's a general sense that these institutions that were meant to be protecting everyone and that they look to protect and say, I'll stay at home because, I would trust you. I trust you when you tell me to stay at home, that I need to stay at home and all the rest of it. That trust now feels quite broken. And I think that's actually behind a lot of this. Now, obviously, you can point to the way the media, especially, parts of the media will grab on to stories that are not necessarily that meaningful and blow them up and all the rest. But yes, absolutely. And I don't think that helps either. But I think there's something more fundamental going on as well.
And do you think it's like a problem of continuous little stories with some of these big ones coming in? Or do you think it's actually these big moments and people kind of accept, okay, one politician expense scandal, that kind of happens, but things like Partygate, things like the big widespread expense scandal from the early 2000s, mid 2000s, do you think those have much bigger shifts in?
Yeah, I mean, those two in particular had absolutely mammoth impacts on how people view politics, and again, not just the individual politicians and parties they tarnish our expenses with. It was a very broad range of MPs, but didn't just damage the Conservatives. That actually, I think it did damage sort of to Labour as well, partly because there were some allegations about Keir Starmer. I mean, it feels like very long ago now to start thinking about this, but I remember the Daily Mail headlines thing that said Sabir Korma or something. You know, there were allegations that he'd had a curry. Anyway, it can all seem quite meaningless to get into now, but it did what I think the Conservative attack dogs wanted it to at the time, which was to tarnish Labour as well with part of it, but that hasn't helped anyone in the long run. And I really do think that now, I think part of the problem with the media and the way we consume it is that it can give us all very short attention spans and short memories for these sorts of things, and actually public it can leave a much longer lasting, greater impact on. I think the other effect of it is because there is this constant stream of news every day, and because it can seem to be quite bad, or about people behaving badly and all the rest of it. Increasingly, I talk to voters and they say, I don't watch any news, I don't engage with any news, I've had enough. And a lot of them will say on their own, it's since COVID, I don't want to do any more of it. And so this is now, again, part of the problem for politicians. So yes, it might be good for politicians that they're not tuning in to every bad thing or every sort of mess up that happens, but it also means it's much harder for politicians to land the things they want to land, because they can come out and make an announcement, say we're going to do this brilliant thing with the NHS or whatever it is, and no one's listening because people have given up. And so it is interesting, and I think you're quite right to point out that relationship between the media and the Westminster, because they're both much more reliant on each other than I think either would necessarily appreciate, and the public trust in both of them is very low. So I think it's an interesting position to be in, and I think one that they haven't fully grappled with yet.
Okay, so if you could change one British public opinion on growth, like one issue that you think affects growth, that you think that actually it's quite, sorry, I know this is quite a weird position for a pollster, because you're not just analysing them now. But what would that be?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I mean, the obvious one to say is some resistance to, I think, some planning projects, especially when it comes to energy infrastructure. I would absolutely love there to be more public support, especially local public support for things like nuclear. Now, we are seeing that public support is actually generally pretty good towards nuclear. In general, in principle, people do support it. But obviously, it's up to the government to actually sign these projects off and invest in them. They should have invested in them a lot longer ago. But I would just love to see many, many, many more energy infrastructure projects built. And I think too often they are held up or not even got to that stage, not even got to a stage where they're being properly conceived of because of anticipated local upset.
How do you think, or why do you think the opinion's changed on nuclear?
Yeah, it's a good question. It could be a couple of things. Firstly, the memory of nuclear disasters could have receded a bit. They're now getting further and further away from one of the ones that everyone talks about, like Chernobyl or some of the other examples. And it also could be that I think there was a general sense in the public. There's not really a sense of how Britain's energy compares to everyone else's. People don't tend to have a good sense of comparisons. Obviously, we compare very badly, our energy costs to everyone else's, but there is a sense they're far too high. And I think people are just saying, well, if it'll bring my bills down, then fine. I can live with it.
Yeah.
To round out, we like to, obviously we've got into a lot of topics of how Britain's in decline, why that is. We like to finish on an idea of a pessimistic take on what concerns you going forwards. Where are your biggest concerns about the future of the UK, and then turning on his head to talk about actually where are the cracks of optimism, what things can drive it. Obviously, if you say LFG, that's great, but beyond LFG or in addition to LFG, where do you see actually this is something I see as a real potential.
So I do spend quite a lot of time being quite pessimistic about the future of the country. So I can see quite a lot of talent leaving. I can see a lot of my friends considering to leave, people I never thought would want to leave. I can see people actually starting to have those conversations and say things like moving to Dubai, which I mean, it's just, 10 years ago, I couldn't have imagined anyone I knew saying they actually wanted to live in Dubai. But, so it can be quite pessimistic. And I think the thing I'm most worried about with the UK is we've now got another 4 years till a general election, which we think we should do. We've still got a massive majority. So there's no real reason why it should end sooner, despite scenes like today. What I'm worried about then is whichever government is elected next, and in whichever form, whether it's a coalition, whether it's a governing party outright, I'm worried about that party, again, a bit like Labour has done now, failing to properly grasp the urgency with which the public want radical change, and to properly grasp that whatever that government is, they are very much people's last roll of the dice. And I feel quite strongly that if they also don't deliver, and again, it's a very high bar to deliver and a difficult bar to deliver, so I have some sympathies, but if they also fail to deliver, I really worry that you might see people turning off democracy altogether. And we're already starting to see small increases in people saying, they would actually quite like a king with no elections and things like that, which can be quite funny to discuss, but actually I think it's getting to something that's a lot bleaker and a lot more corrosive. And so I really do worry about that. I worry about what happens if there's another government in 4 years' time, or a Labour government if it gets in again, but it still hasn't grappled with, again, that urgency for change and the sort of need for quite radical action, I think, to deliver those things. And I do get worried about the consequences of that.
Yeah. And the optimistic angle.
Oh yeah, sorry, the optimistic thing. So one thing I think I do like is that, so you were seeing this with the public, the party loyalties are starting to break down amongst the public. We've seen that for a while. But I think it's accelerating. And what I liked about Looking for Growth actually is the fact that it attracts talent and interest from people across party who are willing to have these discussions and say, what can we do to get better together? Now this sounds like a very naff and cheesy thing to say, but I actually do think that's really reassuring. And I think if we can move to a world which is you have a set of people who are very driven, who are ideas first, who are truly, sort of heard Labour say, Keir Starmer used to say a lot of people before party, the public before party. But if we can actually truly get to a situation where people aren't encumbered by worrying about that sort of stuff and are willing to work together to make the country better, I think that's a good thing.
Excellent. So thank you.
Yeah.
We didn't pay you for that plug of LFG.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. No, it's great. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and join us today. It's
I loved it.
been super insightful.
Yeah, great.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Thank you.